Hello, my name's Kelly Tebow, and I am with the New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, and I will be your organizer for this evening and would like to welcome you to our webinar on In These Uncertain Times, Returning to School in an Age of Anxiety. Thank you all for joining us. Before I have my colleague introduce the speaker for tonight, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items with you. All participants are muted. If you have a question, please type it in the bottom of your question box and click send. You may send as many questions during the webinar. However, we will have Dr. Deibler answer the questions at the end of his presentation. We will get to as many queries as time allows. In addition, tonight's presenter is available to take your questions on the Wednesday webinar blog, which is accessed from our homepage under the heading Programs. This blog will be monitored for the next 7 days. Feel free to look and post questions often as you like, and answers will be archived for future reference. If you missed part of the presentation or would like to watch it again, an archived version will be posted to our website shortly. We value your input, and in order to expand the webinar experience in the future, we need everyone to fill out the survey when you exit the webinar. The New Jersey Center for Tourette Syndrome and Associated Disorders, its directors and employees assume no responsibility for the accuracy, completeness, objectivity, or usefulness of the information presented. We do not endorse any recommendation or opinion made by any member or physician, nor do we advocate for any treatment. You are responsible for your own medical decisions. Now, I'm going to turn over the introduction of our speaker to Christine Wharton, the Medical Outreach Coordinator of NJCTS. Christine?
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly. Good evening, everybody. As you just heard, my name is Christine Warren, and Kelly and I work together to bring you the NJCTS Monthly Wednesday webinar program. And I appreciate all of our attendees joining us here tonight for In These Uncertain Times, Returning to School in an Age of Anxiety with Dr. Eric Deibler. We are very excited to have Dr. Deibler here with us tonight. Dr. Deibler holds a master's degree in school psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology, and he specializes in clinical diagnostic work and therapeutic services for children with severe mental illness. Dr. Deibler has been a school psychologist for 29 years and has worked in a variety of settings, serving children with mental health needs. These include public and private schools, self-contained special education facilities, residential treatment facilities, and psychiatric inpatient and outpatient hospital programs. He's currently employed by the Educational Services Unit of the Burlington County Special Services School District. The Burlington County Special Services School District educates students with special needs from across Burlington County in order to enable each student to reach their full potential through academic, vocational, and therapeutic programs adapted to each student's unique needs and abilities. And it is now my great pleasure to hand off the presentation to Dr. Deibler so we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Christine, Kelly, and NJCTS. So let's get started here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that.
I can.
Great. Okay, so we actually were talking about this presentation last week when I ran through it for the first time, talking about how much things have changed since NJCTS originally approached me about giving this talk about what school might look like when everyone got back and what we could expect in terms of reactions from our kids. We originally started talking about this at the end of the last academic year, and things have done nothing but change since that time, including today. I've seen a number of school districts have revised their plans. What people are doing in different places changes every single day and will continue to change both now and even after this presentation up to the beginning of school and probably even after. Why I picked the title In These Uncertain Times. At the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, when we saw a lot of commercials, we saw a lot of companies starting their whatever their message was with "in these uncertain times." It was over and over and over again that it became essentially a cliche. You can even see on YouTube, there are compilations of all the commercials that start with "in these uncertain times." But cliche or not, it is really true. Things are nothing if not uncertain right now. And one thing we know about anxiety is anxiety does not like uncertainty. So one of the things we're going to be looking at here is how our kids, especially our kids with anxiety, may be reacting to the uncertainty of what's going on, the school that they may be returning to or may not be returning to, and the kind of reactions that we might be able to expect. There we go. All right, before we begin, I wanted to start off with 3 things that are just kind of a general way that I'm approaching this. First of all, like I just said, the situation is going to continue to change. Nobody knows exactly what is happening next. And this is going to continue for an unforeseeable amount of time. We're all going to have to be flexible. We're all going to have to adapt to the situation as it changes. The other thing is schools are overwhelmed and underprepared. And I do not mean this as a criticism. I think this is just simply the position that they've been put in. Staff members aren't trained for this. The buildings aren't built for this. No one has had to go through something like this before, but they have been tasked with finding a way to bring everybody back safely. They are incredibly overwhelmed. They have an enormous amount of things that they have to do. And here in New Jersey, where I'm based, they're trying to follow the guidelines from the governor, and the guidelines are changing over time as well. The schools are constantly having to try and meet these demands and provide the safest situation possible. And I also want to let people know I have a trigger warning in here because we're going to be talking about PTSD, including some of the features of it, trauma, abuse, and this is sometimes a difficult subject for some people to hear. So when we get to those sections, I'll give you a warning again. So what is it going to be like for our kids when they return to school? Okay, I've broken this down into 4 main points: what we know, what we don't know, what to look out for, and what we can do. So what we know is we can take a look at some other kinds of situations that have had traumatic effects, previous studies of disasters, social disruption. But that leads us directly into what we don't know. These things don't necessarily apply exactly to what we have here, a prolonged pandemic. But we may be able to take what we've experienced already and come up with some reasonable assumptions about what we'll see. What to look out for: we're going to be looking out for signs of distress and traumatic reactions in kids, and what those look like, and what you may be able to do about it. The last, what we can do. I'm going to focus in particular on something called psychological first aid. And I have slides about this later on, but in brief, what it is, it's an approach to try and help immediately after some kind of traumatic event to help reduce effects, reduce negative psychological effects later. Now, this is going to be more for school persons and for other healthcare professionals, but there are useful things in here for parents too. And it's a good thing to take a look at very least, to see how these things are structured. So first, what do we know? We're going to talk about some of the lessons that were learned from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, which I'm calling a disaster with social disruption. So we have a traumatic, disastrous event and disruption that happened afterwards. So some basic facts. During Hurricane Katrina in the United States, over 1,800 dead, over 372,000 displaced from their homes, over 100 public schools destroyed with many, many more severely damaged, and the schools were closed for a number of weeks. So in studies of the effects of this afterwards, in the weeks and months following, found children and adolescents showing increased signs of the big 3 that you're going to see repeated over and over again in these things: anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's actually a big 5 because a number of them also will show learning difficulties and behavioral difficulties. But emotionally, we're looking at anxiety, depression, and PTSD as being recurrent themes in these situations. So in the time after Katrina, children were relocated to new schools, but the negative effects, the signs of anxiety, depression, PTSD, persisted. And in a 5-year follow-up, they found that 1/3 of the students who had been displaced were at least 1 year behind academically, behind their peers who were not displaced. Now, this is from Argentina, but it still has some interesting lessons that we might be able to apply. In Argentina in the 1980s and 1990s, there were widespread teacher strikes that closed schools for many, many weeks. So we can look at this as a social disruption for kids without a disaster. So there was no traumatic event, nothing bad happened, the schools were closed. Now, when they went back and they did a study in 2019 of adults who had missed as many as 90 days of school due to these strikes, they found that the kids who had missed school were less likely to have earned a degree, were more likely to be unemployed, and they earned on average 2 to 3% less than people who had gone to schools that had been less impacted. Not even necessarily not impacted, but less impacted. So even in this disruption, relatively short term, still had effects into their adulthood. What we don't know, and this is really important for us, what we don't know are the specific child mental health effects of an epidemic or a pandemic. Now, we have things, we have information, we have studies about epidemics and pandemics, but they don't exactly give us the information that we need. The 2014 Ebola epidemic closed schools for 5 million children for 8 months, but there are almost no studies about the long-term effects. So I'm sure that there were some, but we really can't say much about it. Now, people often compare COVID-19 pandemic to the 1918 influenza pandemic. And we know that that had widespread disruption, had a very large number of fatalities. However, they don't really have historical studies of its effects until the 1970s. So when they started looking back in earnest, the people who were kids then were in their 70s themselves. So they were asking them to look back 50 years or so to say, what was this like? Now, it's interesting. There are some historical things that are written about it that it seemed like the prevailing attitude in the United States, at least, was when the pandemic was over, when their epidemic, the local epidemic was over, people wanted to move on immediately, and they didn't really even want to address it. And you find people now that were not aware that there was this widespread national catastrophe of illness up until, until this happened. They may have never heard of it before. Now, even though they didn't do too many studies at the time, there is a study, it is from Norway, but it is applicable. There's a study in the late 20th century from Norway when they were looking at what were called then asylum hospitalizations, like the early versions of psychiatric hospitalizations. And they were looking over a 50 or so year period from 1872 to 1929, and that covers the pandemic. And one thing they found is during the pandemic, immediately afterwards, there was a huge increase in first-time psychiatric hospitalizations for people who were experiencing emotional problems. Immediately after the pandemic, it went up dramatically. And the things they found when they were interviewing those patients, survivors were reporting sleep disturbance, depression, mental distraction, dizziness, difficulties coping at work, all the things you kind of would expect from a traumatic reaction. Now, they didn't have the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder then, but now we recognize these sorts of things as at very least traumatic effects. What else we don't know, and this is important for us as well, the effects of direct trauma, that's like being there when a disaster happens, versus indirect exposure or disruption. Just maybe you didn't see the disastrous effect, you were not there during the accident or what have you, but your life is altered because of the disruption. Now, this is important. Well, actually, I'll go through this first and you'll see why. So we know that trauma is actually fairly common. Large-scale trauma is common on a worldwide basis. As many as 33 million individuals worldwide are affected by some kind of a disaster, significant social disruption, a storm, an earthquake, warfare, things like this. This is 33 million in a given year. Often youths in those communities may be direct witnesses to very disturbing things to see. Massive destruction, dead or injured individuals. They may see ruins. They may have been evacuated from their school. They may have been evacuated to a shelter. They may have lost a loved one. But what we see overall in these things is there are an increase in, again, the same things we said before, PTSD, anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, learning disorders, and behavioral difficulties. This is common in all of them. However, there are studies that show that youth who are not proximally exposed, that means they weren't there, but they experienced some of the disruption. So they didn't see any of the same things, but their lives are disrupted. They also have elevated rates of psychopathology, but they don't know as much about that. It's not as well studied. So a lot of it is really targeted more at the kids who were through some sort of large scale destructive event. And there's less information available about the kids who weren't there, but their lives are disrupted in some way. But at least we know from this that they do experience some of the same effects. It's just unclear to what degree or to the frequency. Another thing we don't know, and it's worth pointing out here, we don't necessarily know the effects of distance learning and virtual social interaction. You're going to see a lot of people who are going to be critical of it from a learning standpoint, saying, well, I'm not learning as much and my kids aren't learning as much as when they were in class. But I'm going to tell you my suspicion, and really it's only my suspicion at this point. I have a couple things that I think I can back it up with, but it's not the same as a study. I have the feeling that in terms of social interaction and maintaining connection, it is positive. And I feel like I can go out on a limb and say that it's certainly more positive than not doing it at all. And this is something that in a lot of these other studies looking at other kinds of interactions, people in the past did not have this as an option. So there was no way to remain in your home and still have social connections and still go to school. So, and this is going to take a long time for them to figure out. I suspect there's positive benefit from it, but overall, we don't know what the effects are. Now, there are some possible insights that we can gain from, in particular, taking a look at studies that were conducted after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, particularly in New York, because this is an event that has a very heavy disaster component and also has a great deal of social disruption. So there's let's actually go through something that shows you the degree of how things changed in New York, the degree of destruction. 3 months after 9/11, over 18,000 businesses in New York were either dislocated, disrupted, or outright destroyed. 430,000 people had lost jobs. Over $2.8 billion in lost wages, and we're talking 20 years ago and only 3 months. And that there was something that may not be appreciated outside of New York City so much, is that there was a significant delay and disruption in transporting kids to their schools. They had to be rerouted. They had to be maybe take different bus routes, take completely different methods of getting to school because of road closures, construction, debris clearing. This affected 750,000 students. So even that was a major disruption. Now, there's a big study about specifically what happened afterwards. This was taken 6 months after 9/11, and it involved 8,000 some New York City public school students aged grades 4 through 12. Now, in this group alone, now they weren't doing diagnostic stuff. You'll see why it's probable. You know, they seem to be showing signs of this, but they weren't outright diagnosing them. In this group alone, 11% showed probable post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the numbers are hard to nail down exactly, but at least I can give you an idea of how much you would normally expect to see in kids. In a typical 6-month prevalence, and that's how they'll look at these things, in any given 6-month period, 3.7% of boys and 6.3% of girls may also show probable PTSD. So it's 2 to 3 times higher. Probable depression was 8%, where typically you'd expect around 3.2%. So again, 2 to 3 times higher. Probable conduct disorder, and conduct disorder is a significant behavioral issue where kids act out to hurt other people, to deliberately break rules, to violate the rights of others. It's a serious problem. That hit 12%, where normally that's 7.4%. So almost twice as much. And probable other anxiety disorder, they lumped them all together, 25.4%. Normally it'd be about 7.1%, so you're looking at 3 or 4 times as high. Another thing to note from this, I had to put this in as a note at the bottom. The prevalence of all these disorders, especially the mood disorders, has been increasing over time in kids. And the figures I'm giving you now are from the last 5 years or so, somewhere in that range. So 15 years earlier than that, 20 years ago when the attack happened, the results would have been even lower. So I don't have prevalence rates from 2001, but you can just estimate that they were lower, so the degree to which they were showing these changes was even higher. Now, one of the things that this study has that helps us understand is that 40% of those 8,000 some kids had some kind of disruption, some kind of major disruption in their life. A very low number, less than 1%, had their family relocated. Another, a little over 1% had to have their school relocated. A little less than 2% had their school closed. But here's a big one, and we'll talk about this in another slide next. Restricted travel by parent choice hit over 17%. And what I mean by parent choice is these are kids who had their travel, their ability to leave home restricted by their parent, not by like a government order like we're experiencing now, where they're telling you not to go to restaurants or something like that. These were parents telling their kids that it wasn't safe and they didn't want them to go outside. So they were, and that will play in later when we talk for risk factors. But it was the parents making the choice that they felt it was too safe for not safe enough for their kids to leave. And the last one, which is a big one you might expect, almost 1/3 of them had a family member who lost a job. But the one that really becomes important is this restricted travel. You might think that family job loss was more important, but for parent restricted travel, the probable PTSD rate goes up to over 26%, which is almost 3 times greater than the overall group, which is already almost 3 times greater than typical kids. Probable other anxiety disorder hits over 33%, which is, again, almost 2 times greater than this group that had all been through this. And probable depression hits almost 13%, which is almost 2 times greater. So there's something different about this. When kids were not allowed to interact, when they weren't allowed to go anywhere, when they had to stay home, their outcomes were worse. And before anybody gets worried about, oh, well, everybody's been home from school, how's this going to be? It may be for different factors that we'll get to in a little bit here. Common themes in all of these studies, even though we can't necessarily tell, well, we don't have anything that will say exactly what this is like, but through all these different kinds of disasters, direct, indirect, social disruption, all these things have certain things in common. One is that children in traumatic situations predictably have increased incidences of PTSD. Other anxiety disorders, depression, behavioral disability difficulties, and learning issues, the big 5 and the big 3 emotional PTSD, anxiety disorders, and depression. Children who are not proximally exposed to disasters, but have a lot of disruption, they also have increases of these same things, but they don't know to what degree, other than this one study that we looked at. So even though they're not directly exposed to it, they have similar effects, but to an unknown degree. And this is important to remember all the way through. And I'll just read it straight off here. Children are neither equally exposed nor equally affected. So children that have fewer resources, they're economically disadvantaged, they're discriminated against groups, they have less access to health care. Kids with a greater amount of stressors and fewer resources, they fare worse. So the short way of looking at it is the kids in the worst situations have the worst outcomes. The poorer kids get the brunt of it. There is one study actually from the UK about this distance learning experiment that everybody's doing. They did a little differently there, and they were able to show that kids who came from wealthy backgrounds and were in private schools, where their parents were home, working from home, they were typically experiencing virtual school all day long, starting at a normal time and ending at a normal time. They were in class all day. Kids in a lot less of a privileged economic status were in school for an hour a day or less and frequently didn't attend. So even in those 2 groups, the kids who had the most resources, they got the most benefit. And the kids who didn't even get access to school so much. So this is going to come up over and over again. And in particular, we talk about how this is going to affect everybody. Now, here's your trigger warning. We're going to start talking about PTSD, because PTSD is clearly emerging as the most significant emotional factor from this. I mean, anxiety disorders in general are difficult. Depression is difficult. PTSD is fairly significant, and one of the things we're going to look out for at the highest level. So instead of going through just a regular clinical description of the diagnostic things about PTSD, I thought I'd pull this. This comes from the Stanford Children's Health System in California. It's a number of hospitals, health centers, and things, and they have a nice description about what PTSD feels like for kids in a more accessible way. So this is pulled directly from there. Kids who are experiencing PTSD, they can have problems sleeping, they may be depressed, grouchy, irritable. They feel nervous, jittery, alert, and watchful, which clinicians would call hypervigilant. They're looking out for threats. They may lose interest in things they used to enjoy. They may be emotionally detached. They may have trouble feeling affectionate. They can be more aggressive than before or even violent. They might stay away from certain places or situations that bring back memories that are painful or difficult. They may have flashbacks. And I think a lot of people, when you think of flashbacks, you think about how they've been portrayed in war movies where soldiers are reliving scenes of battle, which is something that can happen, but it can be a lot different from that as well, involving something maybe a little less intense and a little less obvious. In kids, they may have intrusive images. They may remember or even experience sounds, smells, feelings. They might believe that these things are happening again, but I think the thing you're going to find the most is that kids have intrusive images and intrusive thoughts about the situation or the trauma they've experienced. Kids might lose touch with reality, so they may actually not be entirely sure what's happening, especially like at a very high anxiety moment. They may reenact the event, especially in younger kids. They may act out some of the things that they've seen or that they've had to do. They may have problems in school in a general sense, have trouble focusing, worrying about dying at a young age or worrying about the future in general. They may regress and do earlier behaviors such as thumb sucking, bedwetting, wanting to sleep with the parents, other kinds of basic regressive behaviors. And they may have physical symptoms we call somatic symptoms, headaches and stomach aches. So these are really more symptoms of their anxiety that they experience physically. You may notice that a bunch of things in here when we talk about having trouble focusing and things like that may look kind of like ADHD, but the important part is that these things are changes from how their function was before. So, you don't suddenly develop ADHD, you have that over time, typically from the time, you were first in school, and usually we expect to see it by first grade, but like a fifth grader doesn't suddenly become ADHD. But kids who are experiencing traumatic stress or just high levels of anxiety in general, they may look sort of the same way. They may be fidgety, but it's agitation, not impulsivity. They might be fidgety. They might have trouble remembering things. They might have trouble concentrating, and it's a change from what you've seen before. Now, let's talk about the prevalence of PTSD in general in kids. And it's harder to say. Most of the stuff you have in our diagnostic manuals and things like that are really written for adults. For kids, it's a little bit harder to say. So we'll talk about the prevalence and then some of the risk factors for what makes somebody vulnerable or more vulnerable to develop PTSD, especially in kids. So what we know in general, somewhere around 15 to 43% of children go through at least one traumatic event of some kind during childhood. Quite a few kids go through quite a bit more than that. Of the kids who've experienced trauma, somewhere between 3 and 15% of girls and 1 to 6% of boys will go on to develop PTSD at some point in their lives. Not necessarily then, maybe much later. In general, though, what you're going to find is that there's a higher risk of PTSD with certain kinds of trauma. Interpersonal violence, like sexual assault, physical abuse, then you're looking at PTSD numbers 30 to 70%, much higher. War and armed conflict, 47%. Being displaced, physically displaced, and living as refugees, it's unclear the numbers of this, but we know that it's one of the things that can contribute to PTSD. And kids who have been forced to be child soldiers, where they are physically forced into combat, that's anywhere from 35 to 97%. And the common theme here is that events that have a higher degree of threat, where you feel like you could potentially lose your life, the higher the degree of threat, the more likely they are to trigger PTSD. Now let's look at some of the risk factors. We'll start out with risk factors in children themselves. Girls are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop PTSD, and that's even after you account for the particular kinds of trauma the girls are more likely to experience than boys. And they don't really know why that is. There's a number of theories, but they don't actually know. But it does seem more common in girls, even if the experiences are similar. Children who have a history of another mental disorder, in particular anxiety disorders and mood disorders, they are more likely to be affected with PTSD, to develop PTSD symptoms. In fact, there's a longitudinal study that I'm quoting here, over 1,000 adults who met the criteria for PTSD. 93.5% of them met criteria for another disorder as children. Now, family characteristics that can be risk factors. One is probably pretty easy to understand, is poor family functioning. So if there's a lot of problems in the way the family interacts, a lot of problems in the family itself, that increases the risk for PTSD. But this is important as well. Parent reactions to trauma, especially when the parents themselves show PTSD, that makes PTSD more likely in the kids. And unfortunately, for one reason or another, it's more significant when it's the mother that has PTSD symptoms than it is with the father has PTSD symptoms. But this is a good point. Children with greater social support are less likely to develop PTSD, and it doesn't really matter what kind of support that is, whether it's family or friends, the school, other kinds of social interaction. Those kind of social supports are protective factors. And that's one of the reasons why I think that having virtual school, even if it may not be as academically effective, it can very much help with this. It helps maintain social supports, or at least that's my belief. Child PTSD factors, responses to trauma. And what I mean is like how the child responds to the trauma. These are some risk factors to watch out for. Higher levels of anger about the event, kids that can't let anger go over what had happened. Higher levels of rumination and catastrophizing. Rumination about an event, rumination means just going over it in your head over and over again. You think about it all the time. Catastrophizing is imagining how bad things could be in the future. It's like, this happened and I'm not going to be able to catch up, and I'm not going to go to college, and I'm never going to have a job. Like that's catastrophizing. More negative appraisals of the event, like they can only see the bad parts. They have trouble seeing the things that are more positive. Elevated levels of avoidance and repression of trauma-related thoughts means like they don't want to think about it, they don't want to talk about it, that they don't want to deal with it. Dissociation, which is feeling that you are removed from your body, or like watching yourself, that things aren't real, all that kind of stuff are dissociative things. Like that's during the event, and that's more for a traumatic situation. And maladaptive coping strategies. And these don't sound negative, like when you say it this way, but like distraction and blaming others. But distraction in this sense really means I'm not going to think about it. I'm going out. I'm going to a party, and I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to keep myself busy. I'm going out on a date. You know, like all these kinds of things where they are trying to keep themselves distracted so that they're not alone with their own thoughts. Blaming others is pretty self-explanatory. It's more like, this happened because of you. I failed because you didn't get me the right kind of tutor. This is your fault. Like that kind of stuff. All of these things are indicative of greater chance of PTSD. Now, what to look out for overall when we know all this stuff? And I just called this my take because this is how I am conceptualizing it myself. COVID-19 looks less like a traumatic event and more like a slow speed, widespread, prolonged social disruption with uneven incidents of trauma interspersed. And what I mean by this is there's a large scale, slow moving, long lasting set of social disruptions where everything is thrown off. Kids can't go places, they can't see people the way they used to, they can't go to school, they can't go to stores, everything else that's happening. But there are traumatic incidents that are in here, and these are not evenly spread out. There are kids in my placement already. There are kids who have lost their parents, lost a parent to COVID-19. There are people who've lost their jobs and have to move. And this, that is not the same experience for that kid as it is for the kid where the parents can stay home and work and they can keep everybody isolated. So there's going to be an uneven amount of trauma. It will be very traumatic for some kids who've lost a teacher, kids who have lost everything. And there are going to be kids who have lost very little except for social interaction. So they're not all coming in with the same experience. What we're going to be looking for in all these kids really is increases in emotional distress, emphasizing depression, anxiety, PTSD in particular. So what are you going to look for when you have kids? What are you going to look for as a traumatic or anxious reaction? And I like this. I pulled this set of things. This is PTSD Reactions, and this is from the STAR Commonwealth. And the STAR family started one of the first schools for boys at this point, boys with emotional problems, with behavioral problems in the United States. And the idea was that None of these kids were problem kids. They just had problems that could be worked on. And the STAR Commonwealth system, 100 years later, is still working, and they're still producing these kind of materials. So here's how they describe it. These are largely their words. Like, what will you see? You might see kids who have problems with memory and learning. And they give very specific examples. An A student becomes a C student, but you're going to see really in general that they're not able to do as much as they were before. They're not doing as well. They're having problems. An inability to concentrate, tremendous fear and anxiety, which of course you'd expect, increased aggression, fighting, and assaultive behavior. And they say that these are some of the first reactions as a change since the trauma. And I'm not sure how accurate that is. It may be, but that's one of the things I guess to consider. I don't know whether you'll see it first or not, but we do look for kids who are having more aggression with other kids, and especially the idea of revenge if there's been some sort of violence. Survivor guilt, where they think that if they had done something differently, things would have been better, or if they've lost a loved one, if they had been the one, if they're the one that actually transmitted the disease to someone else in their family, there's a great deal of guilt. Intrusive images, flashbacks, traumatic dreams. They may talk about how they dreamt about these things happening over and over again. We've already covered that. Exaggerated startle reaction. That's another sign of hypervigilance, where they seem to be very easily set off, very easily startled. It seems overly or more dramatic than it was before. And the idea of emotional attachment and numbing. So in the end, what are we going to do about this? What can we do? And I want to present, especially for our school folks here, elements of psychological first aid. And if you haven't heard of this before, there's still time before the school year starts to get training in this. It's not complicated, but it is a very specific set of things. And I'm going to give you a brief overview here. School folk may find it useful. Parents may be able to use this as well, but I'm actually going to do this in a different order. Psychological first aid was a concept that was originally proposed in an article in 1954, where they were saying that they thought it would be possible through a series of targeted interventions immediately after some kind of trauma to be able to reduce the effects that they would have later. If there were certain things you could do immediately afterwards, you might be able to head off some of the negative effects. And this has turned out to be true. And they've developed this ever since. NIH has worked on it. Kennedy Krieger, Johns Hopkins has worked on it. A lot of people have worked on it. And the stuff that I'm going to be talking about here is something where a psychologist, Dr. Marlene Wong, actually tried to adapt this for this pandemic. So their thing, it's kind of a long title here, Psychological First Aid, PFA, for schools, teachers, and students during the worldwide pandemic. And in particular, the section in this article saying, psychological first aid for schools: listen, protect, connect, model, and teach. And those are the 5-factor approach that they have taken to psychological first aid as applied to schools. They call it really by the first 3 letters, LPC. So let's take a look at this. There are 5 components here: listen, protect, connect being the first 3, model and teach being extra on the side. I'm going to give you the way that they phrase it, and I'm going to try and go through it quickly here. First, listening. And this is the idea of listening in a way that conveys your interest and your empathy. So you are reflecting to them that you hear what they say, that you're concerned about what they say, that it is safe and okay to talk to you about those experiences. Protect. This is a big one. You're going to try and avoid any possibility of re-traumatizing them. So the idea is you're not making the whole situation more traumatic by doing this, where you're going to try to establish feelings of physical and emotional safety. For schools, a lot of this is going to be establishing a routine that they can follow. You're going to calmly offer them information about what's going on and what people are doing to try to keep everybody safe. When kids are nervous about, well, why can't I sit next to this person? You talk about it in a positive way. It's like, well, this is one of the ways that we try to make sure that people don't get sick, and to be able to answer those questions and showing that you are concerned about their safety. Connect. This is really a thing where you're helping them establish and maintain, reestablish actually their social relationships. Try to stay connected to other people. one of the things that happens, like it says here, one of the most common reactions to trauma or fear is emotional and social isolation and the sense of loss of social supports. And we know this is these are some of the biggest complaints that kids had from the very beginning. I can't see my friends. I can't do my sport. I can't go out. This is something that they experienced as a loss right away. So one of the things we have to do is to try to restore, to rebuild these connections using online methods if you have to, but anything like that to try and keep those connections going. It does promote stability and it helps a lot. Model, meaning model is you showing what they're supposed to do. You're modeling the response for them. You're modeling the emotional response, which can be very difficult for adults who are also experiencing this, the trauma of something. But the idea is, and I underlined it here, you're going to try to demonstrate a positive and optimistic approach to a new normal. You're going to tell them about how these things are temporary, but these are the things that we're doing and how we can get through it. And when they're saying things like, I don't know how I'm going to wear a mask all the time, and say, well, I'm not really sure how I'm going to do it either, but I'm going to try. And one of the things I do is I think about how I'm going to be helping my students. If I wear my mask, I'm doing my part to help everybody else be safe. So you're modeling the response, you're modeling optimism rather than anxiety, but you're not telling them you know the answers to everything. You're really just showing, well, I don't know either. I'm not sure, but I'm going to do this, and I know who to ask, all that kind of stuff to show that you can cope. Teach. This is maybe, one of the more practical and important things that you can do. And this is one where parents can do this as well, where you're going to try and show that these feelings are normal. You're going to teach them about these feelings. When, you can imagine perhaps what it would be like to be a child who's experiencing intrusive thoughts of disaster. They've never experienced this before. It's terrifying, and they have no idea what it means, but you do. And you can help them experience this. You can help explain what's going on and say, a lot of people, when they go through these things, when they have difficult situations and stressful events like this, they also have these feelings, and these are some of the things we can do to help. So you normalize their experience and say that a lot of people are feeling it as well. So they understand what the range of normal reactions is. You are helping them put that in context. Now, here are some sample questions that they give about ways of interacting with kids. This is especially good when you don't know what to say. This is the kind of stuff they say, like how to demonstrate this kind of listening. Tell me how you've been affected by stay-at-home orders during the coronavirus. What's your schedule like from Monday through Friday? How do you spend your weekends? I'm ready to listen when you're ready to share. Things like this, where you're asking them really to attend to the structure around them and then hearing what the results are. Protect. Are you worried about your safety? Are you worried about the safety of others? What are you most worried about right now? Connect. Have you ever had to confront a situation like this where you couldn't go outside when you wanted to? And they probably haven't, but by this point, it's very familiar for them. What can your family members do to help? What can your friends do to help? What do you think you can do to make things better? What's been helpful to you in the past when you've experienced a crisis? So these kinds of things, again, focusing them outward. Who is available to help? What can they do? You're not telling them what's going to help or telling them what they should do. You're directing them. You're showing how you can connect them to the things around them that can be helpful and listening to their answers. Model. And this is always a great one. Thank you for the courage you've shown and for sharing your concerns with me. This is where you're making the process kind of, you're taking it and making it overt, where you're making it so like, I'm just commenting on the process. Thank you for the courage in telling me what you've told me. Thank you for sharing this with me. Acknowledge it and say what's happening. Let's talk about some of the things you can do to reconnect with family and friends outside your home. Let's brainstorm some of the ways that other students and adults are coping. Again, focusing outward. Now, for teach, let's see. I'm gonna skip this because I know we're a little short on time here, because I have a slide that's more specific about this. But the idea is you're going to be talking about that. It's difficult to have a new schedule. It's difficult to find regular time for sleeping, like these kinds of things. But I'm going to focus instead here on helping them create a routine. And for parents out there, I'm sure you've had, many of you have had some difficulty with this, keeping the routine when everything has changed. You may have experienced this yourself if you're working from home, or the way your workplace has changed. Keeping a routine when maybe you're in your house all the time. So let's take a look at this. How to set up a routine on school days. Go to sleep, get up at the same time every day. Get dressed, eat breakfast, and brush your teeth just like you would if you were going to school. For these kids that are on hybrid schedules, half days, alternate days, asynchronous, synchronous education, all these things, this is going to be even more important because the routine may change from day to day. Attend online classes if you have them on time. Pick a time where you're doing your work, maybe 9 to 12, noon to 1, things like this. Build in a meal in there somewhere, a nutrition break. Go through it as if you were in the building. Stay off your phone. Don't do social media during the hours when you're supposed to be doing school. You can put the phone away. You can have the child can give the phone to the parents just like they were in school, or like they're supposed to do when they're in school. And a good thing to do, spend dinner time at least, television time or other kind of entertainment like that with your family as a group, if at all possible, at least one meal, and eat healthy and exercise. So the thing you need to try to do is establish a routine that is similar to how things were when they were back in the building or when they were going to school full time. This is part of Teach, and this is part of the stuff that parents can do. So I have a few extra suggestions that I'm going to throw in here as well. Overall, like with this model in mind, but just in general. I want everybody to remember that even as dire as a lot of this might sound, most kids are going to be fine. And most of the kids that are struggling, they will improve. And even the kids that are struggling a lot are going to improve. Our goal here is to make sure that there are fewer kids that are struggling. And the kids that are improving, that need to improve, are going to improve more quickly. So we're trying to head off as many problems as we can. Parents, review your school's reopening plan and let your kids know that it may change. It probably already has changed. Let them know what it's going to be like. Walk them through it. Rehearse the new procedures. Talk about them realistically and non-threateningly, saying like, kids who are going to school on a bus, they may experience a very different bus ride. They might be spread out. Tell them what this is going to be like, and not as if like, can you believe they're doing it? Not like that. More like, oh, they're spreading everybody out. Look how they're trying to do this, maintaining social distancing on the bus. Wow, what do you think that'll be like? Trying to get them to imagine so that it's not a shock when they see it. Walk them through it as much as you can. If they have issues wearing masks, practice wearing the mask. Practice wearing the mask now before they have to go in. Practice wearing the mask in increasing time. Wear the mask with them. So they put on a mask, you put on a mask. Try it for an hour, then 2 hours, then 3 hours. If that's what's going to be going on in your school. Make a consistent place to do schoolwork, which honestly people should do anyway, but it's more important now. So if you are fortunate enough for your children to have access to a desk, that's great. If you don't have a desk, even a counter, a table, part of the table where they go and they work. They're not laying in front of the TV doing their work. They're sitting in a place to do work, and that place is where they do it, so that at least it feels different. Here's my living space. Here is my workspace. And parents who are working at home, this is probably a good idea for you too. If in case you're interested, they're in Los Angeles, they had, I think this summer, 15,000 new applications for permits for, they have some term, I can't recall what it is right now, but they're temporary or auxiliary living spaces, where they're basically like a little shed, but for a particular purpose. And people are putting in sheds that are offices. They're offices, or they're even living quarters. Like if they have people that have been exposed to COVID, they live there perhaps during a quarantine period, or just people that need to work all day and they can't work in their house, or it's messing up their home life to do this. If they have the means, some people are doing this, but you don't have to have that much money to do this. You can separate things, and it's more important now than ever. Don't lay in bed and do your work. Pick a place to work and do it. And the kids should do the same thing. You can model that and you can show them. Maintain a consistent daily routine. Get a bath, get a shower, get dressed. The kids, I mean, well, hopefully the parents do, but get ready as if you were going to school. And this is my own personal one. Help to foster social communications virtually for the kids that do not have they can't do it physically. Think of the things that you can do online. And I don't mean just video games, although I think video games are fun, so especially now. But there's a lot of things that you can do instead. Other things like we've seen kids who've had dinner with friends, where what they do is they eat dinner at the same time and they put a phone and FaceTime or Zoom or something like that. That kid's eating dinner at their house, your kid's eating dinner at your house, and they talk. Little things like that. There are also things like virtual tours. Our family did one of those ourselves, a free tour of a foreign city where everybody could watch and see this. But things like this, a lot of times they get passed off as being, a consolation prize for things you can't do. But they are social connections, and they're social connections that hopefully most people have access to. You can be creative with it. The last thing I want to leave you with, I do want to reiterate again that kids are going to be fine. Most kids are going to be fine even if we don't do anything. But that's not an excuse to not do anything, because there are going to be kids that are going to have trouble. And those kids are the ones that we want to head off and see as quickly as possible, and see if we can do something to make sure that the effects are minimal and that they have the best and quickest chance to improve like everybody else. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we still have some time for some questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was such a great presentation, and there was so much good information. We've got some interesting questions. So let's see. So the first question I thought we'd start with was one that came in wondering about challenges that school counselors might have in identifying students that are struggling if they're only seeing them virtually. You went over some things, some different signs of PTSD and such, but yeah, they're looking for some other tips on how to identify students when we're only seeing them in the virtual world.
That is an excellent question. What I personally, well, I'll give you something that psychologists do. You have a set of screening questions, or if you don't have those, you can put them together now, and you can say things like, have you had any trouble, like how have you been feeling? Have you been feeling anxious? Have you been having any trouble sleeping? Has anything changed? If anybody has had experience with a psychiatrist, these are often the kind of questions that they will ask. So it's not a bad idea to just ask if any of these things are happening, looking for some of those highlights of trauma. So they may not tell you otherwise. They might seem totally fine during a regular session. So my advice is that put in some screening questions that you do every session.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So we also had someone wondering about, for those students that start off with in-person learning, but potentially may end up having to revert back to virtual learning, would you anticipate even more increases in anxiety and other mental health concerns? Would it be a re-traumatizing or disruptive event? Anything you can say on that?
I wish that I knew. For that, I'm not sure. I think it's going to depend a lot on the individual situation of each kid. And I'll give you an example. The way I've heard some people speak, with their kids present, about schools closing again. And I'm, warning beforehand if this will sound inappropriate, but I've heard people say, they're sacrificing these kids. They're going to put them out there, and the minute one of these teachers dies, they're all going home. It's like, those kids are going to have problems if they hear stuff like that. And that's really a concern, where it's like this, for some people, the way they're hearing about this is that it's going to be a disaster. And the sign they'll know that it's a disaster is when everybody goes home. So if that's what they've heard, I would assume that they're more likely to have problems. So maybe one way you can try to head this off is you can tell kids that, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, you can tell kids that there's a possibility that school might close again. And if they do it, it's because they're concerned that they want to make sure that everybody's safe. So I view it as a positive thing. If school is going to close, it means that they're trying to stop a problem. So I would go ahead and phrase it positively. It's still going to happen either way. But I think that would be the main concern there, is the circumstances under which they believe a school would close and what it means for them.
Great, those are some good suggestions. And yeah, definitely, I think phrasing it in a positive manner and being proactive seems like a good bet. And we all are just going to experience this together. And
yes.
Do our
I'll
best.
just say again, it's okay not to know the answers. And if people want answers, and kids may want the answers, it is okay to say that you don't know, but that you're going to cope. That's like that whole modeling thing. Say, well, I don't know what's going to happen when we do this, but we know how to keep safe, and we're going to do that. We're going to follow the best instructions we have. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you for jumping in. So someone was referring back to when you're talking about the post 9/11 studies, where the increase in anxiety was so large compared to the increase in PTSD or depression or conduct disorders.
Yes.
Anything you can say on why anxiety in particular jumped so much compared to these other concerns?
Well, they don't say in the study, but I think a reasonable assumption would be that anxiety disorders in general are much more common than PTSD. If you're looking at overall prevalence data, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health issue in kids. So it's already widespread, and they're counting all of them together. So all the different sorts of things, generalized anxiety disorder, all the other things are there. So they're just looking at their overall increase. So there's more of them to start with, and they are more easily tracked that way.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I have another question here about what to your knowledge, have some schools done to prepare for the emotional and mental health concerns in the students and the staff as we return to the classroom?
Yes. Well, in New Jersey, there's in there what they call the road to return. I think that's the actual term for it. I have so many terms these days, but like the guidelines that have been set out by the state, there is a component in there. So I have been looking at plans from various districts, and I have found everything from detailed plans about how they're going to handle emotional issues to one plan that had a single sentence, and out of all the pages. And I think my assumption for this is a lot of schools don't know what they're going to do with this right now. So they may be putting it low down in their priorities, which is why we all need to know about it. So some schools are relatively well prepared, and we know that some schools are doing things like hiring outside services. They're bringing in extra counselors. They're already doing this because they are saying, we can't develop something in this amount of time, but we can bring somebody in. And unfortunately, there are schools that seem to have done very little preparation for this at all. So the one thing I'd encourage is to see like what your school is doing is read your plan. If you're not sure, you can contact their child study team or the applicable group for the state that you're in. The child study team are the people that do things like evaluations for special education. They're like more where you're going to find the clinicians and ask them what they're doing. If they don't know, I would suggest to them that they study psychological first aid. Tell them that you saw a presentation and that they talked about the availability of psychological first aid. They can get trained for free. They can do some self-training. It's better than nothing. But if they don't have anything, make sure that they at least have that.
Great. So someone was curious if there was any information if adults showed the same trends in increased anxiety and depression, etc., when they're exposed to disasters and disruptions. Do we see the same thing in the adult population?
Yes, actually we do. So I didn't even go over those studies because we were just looking at the effects on kids. The effects on adults are considerably more developed in terms of their studies. There's a lot of studies on them, which is where they get the idea of like what kinds of trauma are more likely to produce PTSD. So there is a lot of literature on that. And yes, like people that are exposed to this and people who have disruption, although there's less information for that in adults as well, are likely to experience a lot of the same things. Maybe not learning difficulties, but job performance difficulties certainly. So that's another thing. I didn't cover it in this, but it is something to think about, that there are going to be a lot of parents and a lot of teachers and a lot of other school staff members who are also having emotional issues, that are having traumatic reactions, and makes things like psychological first aid all the more important. They need to recognize when it's happening to a staff member, and hopefully that the staff member can get some kind of stabilization outside of the district to help with this, because it's totally reasonable that they will have fears as well, that they will have similar issues.
Excellent, thank you. So someone actually reached out and they said that they really, great presentation and they'd love to reach out to you directly. Are you able to share your email address or some way to contact you for anyone that does want to have any questions for you directly?
Yes, I can do that. I mean, I can't, the thing I should say is like, I can't act as a therapist outside of a school system and outside of my job. So I can't give like therapeutic advice, but I can give, if you have any kind of questions about this, I would be happy to talk to you about it and maybe tell you some directions to go if you need something else. Do you want me to just spell out the email address?
Maybe
Might be
if
hard.
you could, if you want to type it into the chat.
Sure, let me find it here.
Great, and while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and grab, I think we'll probably have time for maybe one more question after you go ahead and type that into the chat for anyone who might want to grab your information. And thank you for being willing to share that.
No problem. This is actually this is a private practice. I don't work at the private practice. It's my wife's private practice, but I have an email address there. So make sure long email address.
Great, thanks. So this will be our last question for tonight, but someone was wondering about some of the symptoms and signs of PTSD that you went over. How can you distinguish between, maybe a kid that's exhibiting some of those signs, and whether it's actually PTSD or if it's just something else going on that's maybe not quite so severe?
That is a great question. With this, one thing to think about, in case anybody is not familiar with this, you have the idea of like what psychologists. We're gonna talk about diagnoses. Psychologists and psychiatrists use the same diagnostic manual. Clinical psychologists and psychiatrists use the same manual, but they're things that we'll refer to as subclinical, and it really means that you're experiencing some significant problems, but you don't meet all the criteria for a disorder. So in the end, it doesn't necessarily matter. So you can say like, and the way they work is you have to have X number of symptoms, 6 out of 9 of this group for X amount of time, and 4 out of 8 of this group, like that kind of stuff. But just because you may not meet all those criteria doesn't mean you're not having a problem. If you are experiencing a great deal of distress, if you are finding that it's impacting your life, it doesn't really matter whether it's a disorder or not. So for like kids that are showing distress, the distress is really the only important feature. The idea of a diagnosis is it's showing that you're classifying these things and you may have some idea of what to expect. That's the whole idea. But diagnostic criteria change over time too. So it just makes it easier shorthand to talk with somebody about what's going on. But if you see a significant problem, it's a significant problem. And it doesn't really even matter if it's all the way as far as PTSD. It could be subclinical, but you treat the things that you see. So if you see distress, you treat distress. You treat the symptoms. There's nothing wrong with that. If they all hang together into a diagnosis, that might make it easier, but overall, it may not matter. You work with what they're having problems with. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time to answer all these questions. And of course, if there's anything we didn't get to, it'll be on our blog. And I'll hand it off to Kelly for closing remarks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all for joining our webinar on In These Uncertain Times, Returning to School in an Age of Anxiety. There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is open now and available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archive recording of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site. Our next presentation, Youth Suicide, Starting the Conversation, will be presented by Maureen Brogan and Wendy Sefcik and is scheduled for September 30th, 2020. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Deibler, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great night.
Thanks.